Welcome to our webinar today, which we are organizing as part of ANAMED Library's Digital Scholarship Program. My name is Çiğdem Yıldırım. I am head of ANAMED Library. I have three invaluable speakers today with us. Nancy Micklewright, Jeffrey Smith, and Zeynep Simavi are with us today. Actually, their presentation will showcase network analysis through the case study of pioneering American collector Charles Lang Freer. If I introduce them to you one by one, actually, most recently, Nancy Micklewright was an Mellon Foundation Fellow in the Department of Islamic Art, and at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, working on Ottoman fashion for her next book. Her edited volume, Mohammed Zakaria, The Life and Times of a 21st Century Calligrapher, appeared in 2022. Through 2019, she was head of the Department of Public and Scholarly Engagement at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art. She is a former university professor and senior program officer at the Getty Foundation. She is the author of two earlier books and numerous articles on aspects of visual culture in the Ottoman Empire. Actually, Sana Mirza, who is head of the Scholarly Programs and Publications Department at the National Museum of Asian Art, also would be with us in this meeting, but she unfortunately she couldn't attend to this meeting because of her health conditions. So Zeynep Simavi is with us. She is the Istanbul branch director of the American Research Institute in Turkey, ARIT. Previously, she was National Museums of American Museums of Asian Arts Program Specialist for scholarly programs and publications. Her research interests including the formation of Islamic art as an academic discipline and the histories of collection and exhibitions in the United States. She's currently a PhD candidate in art history at Istanbul Technical University, and her dissertation focuses on the creators, collectors, and major exhibitions of Turkish art in the 20th century United States. Jeffrey Smith is with us as well this evening. He is the registrar for the collections information in the National Museum of Asian Arts Collections Department. As both a registrar and a system administrator for the collections database, he is responsible for all aspects the collections information used within the museum and shared externally. Actually, since joining National Museum of Asian Arts in 2004, he has been focused on standardizing and enhancing collections and the source data to improve the museum system and to make possible new features of its online offerings. He was also shared his experience with managing data for online catalogs, provenance, and network analysis in presentations given in the United States, Europe, and Israel. Actually, I don't want to talk more. So now I will give the word to Zeynep. You have the word, Zeynep.
Thank you very much, Çiğdem, for your very kind introduction and also your invitation to us for presenting our research here in Istanbul for Koç University and ANAMED Library. We're all delighted to be here, and Sana also sent her best wishes to you all, and she's sorry to be missing this presentation tonight. And of course, thank you all for joining us tonight, the audience. So the past decades have seen a growing interest in the formation of museum collections and the role collectors, dealers, and curators play in acquiring and exhibiting art, and hence shaping art historical scholarship. The importance of Charles Lang Freer, whose pioneering vision to establish a national museum devoted to Asian and American art cannot be understated. To start with Charles Lang Freer's biography, we can say that he was born in Kingston, New York in 1854, and he amassed a significant fortune as an industrialist in the railroad car manufacturing business in Detroit, at a time when the city was a bustling center for business as well as emerging as an art scene. In this context, Freer was a pioneering 19th century figure, one of the earliest collectors of Asian art in the United States, whose interest in Asia was triggered through his taste for the American aesthetic movement and his relationship with the artist James McNeill Whistler. Though Freer started his collecting ventures in American art and made his first purchases within the United States, he traveled extensively in Asia and the Near East from 1894 to 1911, taking 5 tours in total in these regions. Freer arrived in Detroit in 1879 with virtually nothing, and in 1899, he retired from the direct oversight of his business empire. In just over 20 years, he amassed a fortune which would allow him to endow a new museum in Washington, D.C., and fill it with the paintings and objects that he had collected. Even considering the booming economy of the Gilded Age, Freer's business success was impressive. When he turned his attention full-time to the building of his collection, he brought the same qualities of intensive focus and sustained effort to that work that he had devoted to his business. Freer had left school after grade 8, but he continued to read and learn throughout his adult life. He accumulated a significant library dedicated to all aspects of art, but particularly strong in the collecting areas in which he specialized. Based on the contents of his library, he read widely in the history, religions, and literature of the cultures whose art he bought. And when it came to collecting, the fruits of Freer's work ethic and attention to detail were amplified by his networking skills. And this is illustrated by the nearly hourly entries of his diaries. The entries in his social calendar during the years in which he consciously sought to build a collection of significance are the perfect basis for a graphical and analytical approach to model his interactions. That Freer also noted others who joined his social appointments speaks to his deliberate networking and provided our effort to map his network with many additional connections between members of his growing and overlapping social circles. So after much debate, in 1906, Freer's gift of his art collection was accepted by the Smithsonian Regents and became the first art museum of the Smithsonian. It opened its doors in 1923 and now is part of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art. Therefore, our project also takes the year 1906 as a starting point and the major milestone in Freer's collecting to investigate his purchases of Islamic and Near Eastern art in the following years, 1907 to 1909. During this period, Freer also traveled extensively in the Near East to visit archaeological and historic sites, to enhance his knowledge on his favorite material, Rockaware, and to meet with local dealers and to make purchases for what he knew at the time would definitely form the collection of the nation's Museum of Asian Art. In short, this period reflects both Freer's interest in collecting Near Eastern art and regional travel and coincides with his formalized agreement with the Smithsonian regarding his establishment of a national museum in Washington, D.C. So Jeff, Sana, Nancy, and I had an opportunity to consider Freer through a new prism of social network analysis through the Getty Network Analysis and Digital Art History Workshop. And I'm now passing the mic on to you, Jeff, so that we can talk about the network analysis.
Thank you. So network analysis might be unfamiliar to some people. I'll describe what it is, and it was new for us when we started this project. Network analysis is a data analytical process that investigates social structures by focusing on the connectivity, relationships, and interactions between individuals Of course, network analysis can be any network. Anything can be a network. But in our case, we were looking at the relationships and social interactions between individuals. So this allows for both a micro approach by focusing on individual relationships and a macro one by highlighting patterns and visualizing potentially unknown links and calculating their strength. It can be used for many different kinds of systems, from today's ubiquitous social networks to economic and sociological communities. A graph of relationships created by network analysis is first and foremost a model of one's data. To the extent that the data is complete, consistent, and rich enough to yield several vantage points from which to analyze the scope of the associations, it can reveal and help visualize connections that otherwise would not fully resolve by other means. Visualizing relationships, the nodes highlight the object of the study, in this case, people, and the edges represent the connections between them. The models allow us to then calculate the strength in between these relationships. Slide 4, please. Network analysis has only recently been used in the field of art history. The goal of the Getty Workshop, which we participated in, which ran from 2019 to 2021, was to bring together teams of art historians, network scientists, and digital humanists to learn to use and apply network analysis techniques to explore different research questions. Our project was one of 7 from a diverse group from across North America and Europe, and considered what new insights this tool can reveal when applied to art historical material and how museum data can lend itself to digital art history projects. Our project aimed to examine key developments in Charles Lang Freer's collecting over a 3-year period, from 1907 to 1909, through the prism of his diaries, photographs, and acquisition of Islamic and ancient Near Eastern art. This period is notable as it follows the formalization of the Smithsonian Agreement and the understanding that Freer's collection would become a national one, and he had the support from the highest levels of the American government. It also saw the significant expansion of collections of ancient Near Eastern and Islamic art, and here are just a few examples of his acquisitions. Additionally, Freer also traveled extensively in the Near East, as you can see on this map. He kept meticulous records of his daily life, travels, and acquisitions, which provided a rich source of material for this project. Freer sought out and corresponded with prominent scholars and art critics, establishing decades-long relationships in some cases. He met these friends and colleagues when he was traveling and often visited museums, private collections, and other sites in their company. He commissioned photographs of his collection and collected photographs during his travels. Much of this material is now in our archives, such as these 2 invoices. Let's go to slide 8, please. Thank you. Our network research was based on 3 data sets: the recorded objects and acquisition sources for Freer's collecting from 1893 until his death in 1919, as recorded in our TMS collections management database. Then added to that, over 2,000 diary entries for the period 1907 and 1909, transcribed by Sana Mirza and recorded as spreadsheet data. Then additional research data that we collected from various sources that was used to reconcile, confirm, and add to this body of information. The disparity between the first 2 sets seemed problematic at first, but we were able to use the complete set of all the acquisitions to frame the much more detailed day-to-day activities recorded in the second. And the 1907 and 1909 period was an important window into Freer's priorities after the 1906 acceptance of his gift to the Smithsonian. Even though Freer's collecting had already been much researched and discussed, we remained agnostic as to conclusions until all our data was assembled and graphed. Great care was taken to keep the information within and between these disparate sets clearly separate and aligned to our research focus. So the next slide is an image of one of his diary pages, and then its related spreadsheet data. So in network analysis, the nodes are individual records for each person or institution, and the lines between them are edges. You only get one line between 2 nodes, but that one line can represent many, many interactions. And so that data behind the graph, behind the visualization, can be manipulated in terms of the thickness of the line, the color, the quality, to visualize the nature of the relationships. So again, nodes are the dots and edges are the lines between them. A graph, which is what this whole diagram is called, and this is a particular small snapshot you're looking at now, may have single or multiple criteria for nodes, depending on the questions being asked and how the graph can be useful in helping to answer them. So network analysis is first and foremost a tool. It is not an end product. It's a means and a tool and a map and a model to figure things out and look at it in a different way. Our graph used nodes of 3 types in order to help visualize the relationships between people, locations of activity, and the kinds of objects acquired by FREER. The size and color of both nodes and edges is directly related to the underlying data and used in a variety of combinations to accentuate the various stories that can be told from the data being investigated. An important element of our project was to make sure that the information on people and their associations was recorded back into TMS using what was called the TMS hierarchy view. In other words, building relationships between people in the database as opposed to just people and objects. To help locate and extract the information needed, a keyword system was devised to mark our records, and it was designed to also allow other subsequent researchers to do the same for their projects. Our investigation largely focused on 3 eventful years from 1907 to 1909, but there is much more data on FREER's acquisitions that can be added to the corpus, now archived in TNS. In fact, I learned this morning that our archives has actually fully digitized all of FREER's invoices and are now available online, something we could have used. Not surprisingly, our first graph of all our data showed Charles Lang FREER at the center with many edges and nodes radiating outward. This is known as an egocentric graph, one that is centered around a single individual or entity. But in order to tease out and investigate the many other relationships between that data, it was necessary to completely remove the nodes and edges that associate with FREER and look at the people around him and those institutions and their relationships. So suddenly it became easier to see many clusters of nodes where they were related by interactions, location, other things like that. From there, we played and experimented with a variety of layouts in order to explore the data and learn network analysis and learn about the software program Getty that we were using to do the mapping. Eventually, we settled on 1 or 2 layouts designed to accentuate communities of related nodes. Here you can see these concentrated groupings of data emerging from the overall graph. From there, we began to focus on important areas of the graph and draw them out individually. This not only provided visualizations for the various narratives being investigated, but also showed where data was lacking, prompting some further research. Shown here are the graphs for the dealer Telekin and all of the data associated with Egypt, where FREER traveled and acquired many objects and important manuscripts. Shown on the left is FREER's network in his hometown of Detroit, which was easily the largest due to his innumerable social activities there. The sparser graph on the right maps the visits he made to see other collections, an important activity which contributed to the growth of his knowledge and his contacts throughout the world. And now Zainab would like to discuss some of the prominent individuals in FREER's orbit.
Thank you, Jeff. So as mentioned before, the diary data on which our network graphs are based includes FREER entries on the places that he visited and the people he met. This data provided us a skeletal framework for our understanding of FREER's collecting practices, and its analysis allowed us to better understand the social network associated with FREER in different geographic regions. So even just a quick glance at FREER's diaries at the beginning of our project presented us with a man who was extremely social. So just for the 3 years that our project focused on, from 1907 to 1909, we transcribed a bit more than 2,200 entries with 75 travel locations. And among these entries, about close to 1,800 were marked as social occasions, demonstrating us the sheer scale of FREER's social interactions. The network analysis highlighted for us the role of several types of actors who particularly facilitated FREER's engagement with new networks, such as translational dealers that FREER interacted with in a number of locations and influential local officials, among others. So prominent amongst the translational dealers was Telekin, who established a global operation with branches in New York, Paris, London, and Cairo, and each of these locations appears to have been visited by Freire himself. Telekin arguably created a market for Islamic art in the United States. He educated collectors and facilitated acquisitions. For instance, in a letter to Freire, Telekin informs him of J.P. Morgan and Henry Hemeyer's interest in purchasing works from him, as well as stating that the director of the South Kensington Museum, Sir Putin Clark, praised the quality of works acquired from Telekin himself. Therefore, he might have endeavored to have a similar relationship, an advisor and facilitator role with Freire as well. Telekin is a rare individual appearing in multiple locations with Freire, and he seems to have facilitated connections with local networks. For instance, the diary data showed us that in early 1907, Telekin accompanied Freire in his visits to unspecified antiquarians and social events in Egypt. Then in August 1907, this time Telekin visited Freire in Detroit, and he also accompanied Freire to galleries in New York as well as in Paris in 1909. Another prominent name, especially in the context of Istanbul and also for the art and antiquities field in the Ottoman Empire that Freire was associated with during his travels was, of course, Osman Hamdi, a well-known painter, archaeologist, and a key figure in the Ottoman Empire's cultural relationship with Europe. Freire arrived in Istanbul on July 1st, 1908 from Aleppo via Beirut, and according to his diary data, he had an interview with Hamdi Bey on July 9th, followed by visits to local museums with him. When we took a close look into the diaries of Freire, this time from year 1900 to 1918, over the period of 18 years, we saw that there were only 4 instances that Freire used the word interview for his social interactions with other people. So from this rare use of the word, we could assume that his interaction with Osman Hamdi Bey was actually on formal grounds. When Freire and Osman Hamdi Bey met in 1908, Hamdi Bey had been the director of the Imperial Museum for 27 years, and he had recently completed the construction of the final building of the Imperial Museum. Actually, it was the 3rd building completed under his directorship. Furthermore, during his tenure as the director of the Imperial Museum, as well as that of his successor and brother Halil Ethem Bey, the Imperial Museum served 3 important functions, one being collecting of antiquities, the other supervising the excavation activities across the country, and the 3rd one serving as the general directorate of the antiquities and museums. So we can safely assume that it could be under this 3rd capacity that Freire might have had an interview with Osman Hamdi Bey, especially if Freire was to export any antiquities from any part of the empire. He probably needed to get the relevant permissions from Osman Hamdi Bey. And we also know that on his voyage to Istanbul, Freire had learned that a shipment of sculpture that he had purchased in Syria had been held up by government officials. So while in Istanbul, Freire spent a certain amount of time conferring with the American ambassador and most probably with Osman Hamdi Bey about possibilities for obtaining the release of these sculptures. Another obvious shared interest that connects these 2 men is the museum field. Osman Hamdi Bey was the first Turkish director of the Imperial Museum and the major driving force in forming its collections, deciding on the display strategies, as well as creating the appropriate spaces for storage and exhibiting the museum's holdings. And considering Freire's plans for establishing his own museum with the construction of a new building on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and Freire's keen investigation of various display strategies for his art collection, there might have been lively conversations between the 2. Freire's letter, sent from Istanbul on his last day, that is on July 16, 1908, to Colonel Hacker, gives an interesting yet vague clues into Osman Hamdi and Freire's meeting. I will also read the quotation that you'll see on screen. You will see by the above date that my visit here did not end at the time named in my cablegram of last week. A number of things prevented, especially interviews with Hamdi Bey, director of the Imperial Museum and chief of antiquities and archaeology for the Turkish Empire. A powerful official, in fact, all powerful in his department and the most charming gentleman. My interviews with him have, I now think, put me in line for carrying on some dreams which have recently beset me. Our ambassador, Mr. Leishman, and his principal secretary are hand in glove with Hamdi Bey, and they have worked splendidly for me. The story is too long for any letter, and the plans are too far in the future for this letter, as I will save the details for a talk with you after I get home. So the plans for the future that excited Freer at the time are lost to history. A week after Freer departed Istanbul, on July 23rd, the Young Turk Revolution took place, which ended the period of istibdat, the sole rule of Sultan Abdülhamid II, and restored the constitution, inaugurating what is known as the Second Meşrutiyet period in Ottoman history. The political changes in the empire did not impact Osman Hamdi Bey's prominent role in the arts sector. However, Hamdi Bey soon after that, on February 24th, 1910, must have made the plans too far in the future impossible to realize for Freer. Both Telekin and Osman Hamdi Bey, among many others, are bridges in between networks, and they highlight the need to expand the research to place Freer into greater context. Yet these anecdotes also illuminate one of the biases of the data, the diary data that we used. Freer records the names of external parties more so than his own staff and assistants who were doubtlessly involved in his travel and purchasing decisions. These invisible actors could be expanded to include the numerous women we were unable to historicize, but were a major part of Freer's milieu. So out of more than 2,200 transcribed diary entries for the 3 years that our research focused, a bit more than 25% of them are women. Some of these women were either the wives or daughters of Freer's male social circle, and Freer socialized with them as family, while others were one-on-one or all-female group interactions. The interactions as family is particularly dominant in his travels to the Near East. For instance, in the region, Freer's meetings with key local expats tend to be accompanied by their spouses. If he had a business meeting or a site visit with an official, he also had one social meeting with the official and his wife as a couple. On the other hand, the diary data demonstrated another trend for Freer in Detroit, where he was based at the time. Freer had visits or meetings with the local women without necessarily accompanied by a male member of the household, indicating a close social circle with women in Detroit. In addition to his circle in Detroit, other women that Freer interacted frequently were the wives or family members of artists and scholars. For instance, in London, he had multiple visits to Rosalind Burney Phillip and Ethel Weebly from Jace McNeill Whistler's circle, as you see on the screen. And through his diaries, we also know that Freer met with Mary Meyer Riefstahl in Paris and Luxembourg, who was the wife of the Islamic art scholar and dealer Rudolf Meyer Riefstahl. And Freer also helped Mrs. Spinellosa, the widow of Freer's close friend and art advisor Ernest Spinellosa, as the letters they exchanged demonstrate. While Freer's diaries give us a good glimpse and form a sound basis with its references to the numerous interactions with females, with more research conducted on the roles women played in the art world in the 19th century and beyond, their contributions will be better judged. Now I'm passing the mic on to Nancy.
Okay. Thank you. I'd just like to add my thanks to the rest of our group, to Chidem for the invitation to be here today and for your very lovely introduction. So when we started this project, we imagined that the photographs Freer collected during his travels in the Near East would give us useful information about his collecting practices and how his activities compared with those of his peers. As it turned out, the photographic record of Freer's life is spotty and compared with many other travelers and collectors, not particularly extensive. Yet a careful look at his photographic archive does provide intriguing insights into how photography figured into Freer's collecting. It's important to note at the outset that any study of this kind is limited by what has come down to us, filtered through the vagaries of time, and most likely a careful editing on the part of those assembling Freer's papers in libraries in Detroit for shipment to the museum after his death. This image shows us one of the photographs Freer acquired in Aleppo of the minaret of the Great Mosque and the network graph of his short visit there, which was 12 days in June of 1908. Photographic portraiture was very, can I have the next slide? Thank you. Photographic portraiture was extremely popular in Freer's day, and he had portraits made over the course of his life. As an up-and-coming businessman in Detroit, Freer hired local photographers for his portrait, as in the previous image, this one, by Bracy, Deal and Company. And then decades later, as a well-established collector and philanthropist, Freer's portrait was made by Edward Steichen, one of the most prominent American photographers of the time. Freer also kept informal photographs from social events and outings with friends, although the modest number of these, which ended up in the archives, suggests that the majority of these images were elsewhere. Freer's travels to Egypt and the Middle East over the period of 1907 to 1909 took place at a transitional time in travel photography, with multiple photographic formats available to travelers. The photographs that Freer collected documenting his visits are a surprisingly scanty and random assortment of postcards, studio portraits, commercial views of the monuments of ancient Egypt, Islamic Aleppo, and snapshots of Cairo and Syria. And we see a selection of those here. Commercial photography studios owned in the early decades of photography by foreigners and then by local residents were numerous in Cairo, Istanbul, and other major cities of the Ottoman Empire. In Freer's case, on his 1906-1907 visit to Cairo, he visited the studio of Paul Dietrich, an Austrian photographer whose studio was recommended in the book New Egypt, a guide which Freer had with him. Together with his traveling companion, Dr. Frederick Mann, his guide, Ibrahim Ali, and the dealer, Ali Arabi, Freer sat for 2 photographs taken against a studio backdrop of the pyramids, and we see that on the far left of this slide. Freer also purchased 35 views of the monuments of ancient Egypt, many of which were sites that he had visited on his 1906-1907 trip. These were taken by well-known commercial photographers active in the region, including Maison Bonfils, J.P. Seba, Zangaki, and Antonio Beato, and they would have been for sale at many of the places that Freer visited. Images such as these may be seen in countless collections of travelers who visited Egypt in the period from 1860 to 1910 or so, and that is the image on the lower right of this slide. Less commonly found are the 12 commercial photographs from Aleppo that Freer bought when he visited the city in 1908. Unlike Cairo, Aleppo was not a major tourist destination, and commercial photography studios were not as numerous. Postcards, with the photographic image on one side and a space for the message on the reverse, began to be produced globally in large numbers beginning in the 1890s, and we're looking at that in the middle of this slide. Freer sent this postcard from Egypt to the caretaker of his home in Detroit, Stephen J. Waring, and most likely sent postcards to other of his friends as well. Snapshots, marketed first by Kodak with the Brownie camera of 1900, were also in wide circulation by the time of Freer's travels. The archives hold snapshot-type images from Syria and Cairo among Freer's photographs, and we see one in the upper right, with no accompanying information about source or photographer. One of the Freer without Freer network graphs that we developed, showing only photographers, reveals the global and disparate nature of Freer's interaction with them, even without including data from East Asia. It's a sparsely populated graph, revealing the limited extent to which Freer engaged with photography. Many of the names appearing in the graph were connected with each other through business and professional associations, and many had connections to multiple locations, as the photographic network in the Middle East was a highly populated and interconnected one. Photographers traveled across the region to add sites and scenes to their image catalogs, often maintained shops in several cities, and sold or reused negatives from each other. The highly networked nature of this group does not appear in a graph limited to Freer's interactions. But by looking at the photographs themselves, together with the data generated through our network analysis, we're able to understand more about how Freer consumed photography. Compared to other collectors and serious travelers, Freer's collection of travel photographs is extremely modest. While some collectors used photographs to provide a context for their object or to document archaeological work, Freer's interest was in the pieces in his collection in their own right as aesthetic objects. His engagement with photography as it concerned his collection was practical. He commissioned installation views of the Peacock Room in his house in Detroit, which is what we're seeing here, and other views of his objects on display there and elsewhere, used photographs as a means of discussing possible purchases with dealers abroad and to illustrate publications concerning his collection. Freer brought his business acumen and interest in new technologies to his collecting practices, as when he commissioned the American photographer Alvin Langdon Coburn to make a series of autochrome images of objects in his collection for an illustrated lecture on Whistler to be given by the well-known art critic Charles Caffin. In a February 1909 letter, Freer writes, quote, "Since my return from New York, I've been very busy and deeply interested in an attempt being made in my gallery to reproduce the more important Whistler paintings in my collection by the Lumiere colored photograph process. Confidentially, Mr. Charles C. Caffin of New York, with whose writings you are doubtless familiar, is preparing an important lecture on Whistler. And when he arrived here last week, he brought with him, by my consent, Mr. Coburn, one of the leading American photographers who has already established a fine reputation in both Europe and America. Mr. Coburn brought with him a large supply of Lumiere plates of various sizes, and the present is the 8th day of his experiments in trying to make satisfactory color slides of Mr. Whistler's work. He has thus far succeeded in getting about 20 good slides," end of quote. The Lumiere process had only reached the market in 1907, but Coburn had already made a name for himself with his color images. So by engaging Coburn, Freer was at once embracing a new technology and hiring a well-known and highly regarded photographer. Coburn did not confine his photographic efforts to Freer's Whistler paintings. The surviving images also include 9 autochromes showing small assemblages of Islamic ceramics and Asian pieces on a Chinese wooden table, and we see one of those here, a few of Freer interacting with pieces from his collection, and several portraits. A handful of these images have been reproduced or exhibited, but in general, they're little known. Autochromes were the first commercially viable color photographs, but they presented viewing challenges since the process produced a single positive image on a glass plate. Coburn's autochromes of Freer's ceramics allow us to see the combinations of pieces that Freer found pleasing and give us some insight into a part of his collection of Islamic art with which he was very fully occupied at this stage of his collecting. And in this image, Jeff has matched the images in the autochrome with pieces in the collection, and we know from their collection numbers that these were actually pieces that Freer acquired during his travels during the period of our research. So as I hope we've shown, network analysis allowed for a renewed focus on the multitude of individuals involved in Freer's social circles, the importance of specific cities and how layered these networks were. It complements existing scholarship that is focused on Freer's personal biography and those he interacted with by taking a macro approach. Yet the study is limited by our primary source data, Freer's diaries. Our analysis is based on the individuals Freer's noted. This excludes his staff, travel companions, and perhaps close friends whose relationships are better glimpsed in Freer's correspondence. We were able to gather information on his travel patterns, the routines he established at each city, the amount of time he spent visiting collections and seeing sites, as well as meeting with key people and conducting business transactions in more quantifiable ways. In doing so, we have insights on the construction of the National Museum of Asian Art's collection of Islamic, Egyptian, and ancient Near Eastern art from a new vantage point. The research has exposed a wealth of possibilities for further research by going deeper into Freer's letters, invoices, and collection records, but also by expanding the parameters of this work to build and link the networks of other major collectors and museum founders. These tantalizing possibilities will, however, await the next project. And thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to questions.